Welcome to Close Listening. Today we are discussing cats and birds. Can cats like birds? Can you? Just kidding. No. I recently listened to the album Turn, Turn, Turn by the Byrds. And this was an album that really was a long time coming for me. When I was 12 years old, first learning to play guitar, first getting into music, I was given a copy of Mr. Tambourine Man by the Byrds, very special to me, and it just never occurred to me to listen to the sequel. Now, I did know the title song from Turn, Turn, Turn because my parents had these Dick Clark Show greatest hits albums that had Turn, Turn, Turn on it. And I think maybe I saw it in some music documentary as well. But it just never occurred to me for some reason to say, maybe the Byrds have another album. Maybe there's one that feels like a pretty direct sequel to this one. And lo and behold, here it is. I don't think it even occurred to me that this record existed until a few years ago when I was watching the Echoes in the Canyon documentary. And these singer-songwriters from the 90s, people like Jacob Dylan, Beck, Regina Spektor, Cat Power, were going through their record collection, admiring the hippie singers from the Laurel Canyon era. And this one came out. Anyway, I found it at the library recently, and I decided it would be finally time to listen. So this album is, of course, defined by its amazing title track, Turn, Turn, Turn. It's a song written by Pete Seeger, though the individual lyrics are largely lifted out of the Bible, out of the book of Ecclesiastes, I think you say. And I read it as an optimistic song because it's a song that sort of lists these opposites, a time to be born, a time to die, a time of war, and time of peace. And since it's written in the 60s by, a left-wing protesting, or perhaps it's saying now is a time of war, but one day we will have a time of peace. It opens with a great little catchy riff, kind of in the same way as Mr. Tambourine Man, and the vocals just gradually get more epic as the song progresses. It's a great track for a reason. Now, what about the other stuff on this record? Can it rise to the level of the title? Well, maybe not quite, but it's still interesting to listen to. Track number 2 is called It Won't Be Wrong. I recently posted a review of the Beck album Hyperspace, in which I argued that love is the subject of 90% of pop songs, and as a result, sometimes one hears love songs in a context where they feel kind of soulless, like the singer isn't actually singing about love. And I kind of got that impression from It Won't Be Wrong as well. It Won't Be Wrong is a song in a raucous minor key with kind of in-your-face vocal harmonies. It's definitely a cool track, a nice little 60s jam, but can it really feel like a love song when you have all this noise at once saying this sort of subtle message of wanting to be in love? The way I was able to enjoy it, it actually made it a pretty cool song, is I'm thinking, okay, this is right after Turn, Turn, Turn on the album. Turn, Turn, Turn is a biblical song. What if It Won't Be Wrong is not a song sung by a longing lover, but by a god? Though maybe not the authoritarian God of traditional Christianity. It's sort of more of a God in nature, a Mother Earth figure who just needs our love just as much as we need that godly love back. I don't know, fun interpretation. Track number 3 is called Set You Free this time. This one is written and sung by Gene Clark, and it kind of sounds different than the more standard Bird stuff. It sounds more like a country song. The delivery of this one is a bit stiff, so it's hard to unequivocally enjoy, but it kind of reminds me, I guess, of a cowboy who is on the macho side, but willing to be a little bit sensitive. And the first verse of this song is certainly a stinger. The first thing that I heard you say when you were standing there, sitting in your way, was that you were not blind, as in, man, it must be really obvious that I'm unattractive. Track number 4 is Lay Down Your Weary Tune. And this is a Bob Dylan song, though it's one that Bob Dylan had not recorded at the time, and I think would only be recorded by Bob Dylan much later in his bootleg series. So the Byrds version is the definitive version. And while Turn, Turn, Turn may be the most famous song on this record, I felt that Lay Down Your Weary Tune was kind of the hidden gem. It mostly sounds like Byrds classic stuff, but Chris Hillman's bass playing is a bit more emphasized, at least when you listen to it through headphones. So that gave it a bit of a different feel. And otherwise, it just plays to that same wonderful landscape that Mr. Tambourine Man is set in, a sort of psychedelic world where music, magic, and the landscape are all kind of interchangeable. And rest yourself neath the strength of strings. What a great line. Track number 5 is a folk standard called He Was a Friend of Mine, but it was rewritten to be about the assassination of JFK. I feel like this is one that you could dive into as part of a bigger exploration of the politics of the 60s, which is, not my aim of this video, but I just thought I'd flag it for potential future discussion. It seems like a lot of 60s singers, from the Byrds to Neil Diamond to Phil Oakes, Dion as well, were really enamored with JFK and, felt moved to speak out about his tragic death. It's hard to know in hindsight what were the politics of that. Like nowadays, we have all these celebrities who, will put themselves out as liberal, but not necessarily radical. And were the 60s really the same thing? Were these, hippie singers really only interested in honoring liberal mainstream politicians? Or in fact, was there something about Kennedy that sets him apart from the liberal Democrat politicians of the day? Was there a sense that, the way he got us out of the Cuban Missile Crisis was he was the one president who could have done that without ending the world. He was the one president open to the idea of peace and anti-imperialism, even if he wasn't nearly as much of that as radical socialists would want him to be. Anyway, there's something I don't quite like about the sound of this version. I kind of prefer the folk version of someone like Dave Von Ronk, but it's cool that the Byrds did this. It's an interesting historical document. Track number 6 is called The Words All Around Here. It's another Gene Clark composition. It's a love song with kind of psychedelic feel to it, possibly something you'd lump in with the Indian sitar influenced songs in a minor key. This song uses the phrase set her free to refer to a breakup, which is, a slightly odd phrase that we also hear in his earlier composition, which was, I guess, called Set You Free this time. And one interpretation is, maybe these songs go together. Set You Free this time is about someone unhappy in love, and this is like someone with another perspective who's eyes are starry-eyed. Anyway, yeah, Gene Clark showing some range. Track number 7 is a cover of another folk standard called Satisfied Mind. It's an easy kind of loose performance. You can really hear Gene Clark's tambourine playing on it. That's the funny thing. I feel like the commercial appeal of the Byrds is that they maybe gave a full rock and roll sound to some of these overly simple sounding folk recordings by people like Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger. But the Byrds didn't necessarily have a too loud, raucous, in-your-face sound. And if they picked the wrong song, their sound actually sounds kind of raw, empty, DIY. Their guitars aren't too loud. Tambourine is a key part of their sound. Their folk rock is still closer to being folk than being rock. Track number 8 is another Gene Clark composition. It's called If You're Gone. And yeah, as I was saying, I feel like one of the things going on with the Byrds, at least on these first 2 records, is they are trying to be what I call a true band. And I said this of the early Who albums as well, where it's clear that they're trying to only use the instruments that they play themselves. Someone plays an organ on He Was a Friend of Mine, but otherwise it's just the 2 guitars, the bass, the drum, and the tambourine. And the Byrds do a fairly good job of getting different sounds out of just these instruments. So on this one, there's this very eerie backup singing humming that allows Clark singing to sound like it's floating on a cloud of mystical steam. As for the actual lyrics, this one sounds kind of like a meditation about maybe one day love will come. So I guess it completes the trilogy of Gene Clark's songs. One was about someone being unhappy at the end of a relationship. One is someone longing for a specific relationship. And then maybe this is the third mature final song, which says, the right relationship will come when it will come. Track number 8 is a cover of Bob Dylan's The Times They Are Changing. They don't do anything too radical to adjust it. It's just a bit more upbeat. And of course, you can hear the jangly 12-string electric guitars. Track number 10 is Wait and See. I believe this is a McGuinn Crosby composition, and it has a bit of a rough sound to it, but it's the closest thing to a catchy and earnest sounding simple love song on the record. And then finally, we get a cover of Stephen Foster's Oh Susanna. It has some nice emotional vocals, and it manages to make a solidly modern, 1960s version of a song that Stephen Foster wrote back in the 1800s. And I guess it kind of mirrors the choice of classic for ending Mr. Tambourine Man. That one ended with We'll Meet Again. So yeah, overall, this was a pleasant experience. I don't know if any song will quite sit in my memory the same way that absolute hit Turn, Turn, Turn does, but it's a pretty solid record throughout. It's also kind of historically significant in that you could even argue this was the last Byrds record. So when album number 3 comes out, it introduces a huge Byrds original in 8 Miles High, and Gene Clark was involved with that one. But otherwise, Gene Clark pretty much just left the Byrds after band number 2. And while the other original four were around for the first 5 albums, after album number 5, David Crosby and Michael Clark get fired. So by the time they get to album number 6, it's just Jim/Roger McGuinn. He changed his name to Roger for some weird religious reason, and Chris Hillman, the bass player. And even weirder still, on that 6th album, Sweethearts of the Rodeo, they bring in future or maybe already country music legend Graham Parsons as a new member of the Byrds, and he basically defines that album, and then he leaves the Byrds immediately thereafter. So, the Byrds, are an iconic band in some sense, but they're one of these bands that couldn't maintain a consistent identity. The name Byrds lasted far longer after, the core Byrds had started to fly away, so to speak. And again, this brings me back to, why the Beatles were such a special band. Once they started making real recordings, they kept their lineup together for 12 albums or whatever it was, the same 4 guys. So many of these other bands are much looser coalitions and end up losing people who are, key defining members of their sound. So Byrds, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a band, stayed around through the 60s, but in a way, these are the only 2 Byrds albums, and they're pretty good ones. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.